Good morning, church. Our story takes place at night. I read to you out of Genesis chapter 32, verses 22 through 32. That night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it's daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and as he was limping because of his hip. Therefore to this day the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. This is a story about a man, a story about a nation, a story about a great conflict at night that may be a literary device. This great conflict, this wrestling match as it is described, ends at daybreak. That too may be a literary device, a metaphor, a way of saying that something new is about to happen. We know that the story is about a man named Jacob. We are Jacob. We are engaged in a great conflict as a people, as a nation, as a human race. And as you may remember, Jacob was a very complex individual in the biblical narrative. He was a deceiver. He lied to his father. He stole from his brother. He ran away as a coward. He was also a man who deeply loved a woman. In this story, there is so much that takes place about names. Tell me your name. Why do you want to know my name? During the protest here in Minneapolis around the murder of George Floyd, there were many chants that I heard that said, "Say his name." And I saw it spray painted on boards that were covering glass windows. Say his name, George Floyd. And I got to be honest with you, I read, I obviously watched not much, but a little bit of the video of Rashard Brooks in Atlanta this week. And I read in a interview that he had given just a couple months ago about what it was like to spend a year in prison. And it broke my heart to combine what I read with what I saw. And again, in some tragic, metaphoric way, he was engaged in a struggle that took his life, literally and figuratively. His name was Rashard Brooks. Say his name. He was a father of 3 daughters, like me. And since we're talking about names here in the beginning, those of you who are watching and who are fathers, there's no more important name than you'll ever own than father. Happy Father's Day to you guys. I also guess I want to point out, as I look at my notes here, that, you know, we are given names, and we are characterized by our names in somewhat. And especially in Jacob's culture and in Jacob's time, his name meant heal. And so in the biblical story, that your name was also a descriptor of your character. And as you know, sometimes the names that we place on ourselves limit us. Names can describe us, define us. And what's most important in this story is the transformation of a character and a new name. In New Testament language, we might say this is a born again story. And what's most important is the name that God gives us, not the name that we give ourselves or that has been placed on us, but the name that God gives us. And excuse me, my lights are dark. Oh yes, really looking at my notes. You know, the thing here that I have loved seeing artistic expression of is the wrestling match that takes place in the night. You know, Jesse Ventura, our old governor here in Minnesota, was a wrestler, and Hulk Hogan and some of the names of the great wrestlers that come to mind. When I was growing up in Pittsburgh, it was Bruno Sammartini. That will tell you if you're really old if you know that name. But anyway, in verse 24, it says that Jacob wrestles with a man, and it just kind of, the man comes out of nowhere. And you know, you got to ask yourself, who is this man that Jacob is wrestling with? Could it be God? And in fact, it seems as though it is God. That's the name Penuel or Peniel, the face of God. That's what the being or this entity says to Jacob at the end of the narrative. You have wrestled with God. Maybe it's God, and maybe it's Laban, his uncle, that he left in order to go home after some strange relationship with him. Maybe he's wrestling with his father figure, the one that he lied to and ran away from and cheated, and who he didn't really know. Maybe he's wrestling with himself and his past and some of the decisions that he's made. Maybe he's wrestling with his faith. Maybe he's wrestling with an angel, a representative of God. Maybe he's wrestling with his future and the decisions that he's trying to make as he journeys home. You know, Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, right? There's no place like home, and he's trying to go home, and maybe he's wrestling with the ideas of what does that mean for him. And so you have to ask yourself, who is he wrestling with? And the answer is yes, he's wrestling probably with all of these things. And I could ask you at this point in your life, as we are wrestling as a nation with the history of racism in our country, the pain that is still within our communities, one of the painful parts of reading about Rayshard Brooks was not just the failure of the police department, but the failure of the time he spent in prison was just but 1 year. The time that could have been used to help him was time really that only burdened and hurt him. We are wrestling with so many things right now in our country. And that's why I think this story is so apropos in many ways. The other really interesting piece in the story for me is the fact that he is wounded in the story. He holds on until I don't think he overcomes in the wrestling match, but he doesn't lose. He holds on, much just like the story when we first see him. He's holding on to his brother's heel, and now he's holding on to this one that he is wrestling on the ground with, and he's wounded in the process of this wrestling. And whenever I think of being wounded in the midst of wrestling with faith or with the issues at hand in our lives, I always think of Henry Nouwen, the great author, priest, activist, who wrote a powerful book called The Wounded Healer, and how we have opportunity in our lives to either heal out of our wounds or to continue wounding out of our woundedness. And in this story, what daybreak represents is the fact that Jacob gets a new name and he becomes a wounded healer, and his name is changed and to Israel. And what the most powerful point of all of this story is very simple, and it is this: that God's divine grace in his life that he experienced as a result of that wrestling was not given him because he was a man of great character. The man he became, the divine grace, was the source of that change, not the reward of character in his life. Does that make sense to you? That it is God's grace that changes us. And he crossed that river. He became a humble man who bowed before the brother that he cheated, and he asked him for forgiveness. He humbled himself. He repented, and he changed. That is my prayer for our country right now. This story, this is who we are. This is our watershed moment. We are either going to drown in that river, or we are going to run again as cowards, or we're going to hold on and wrestle with the truth until the day breaks and our name and our country is changed. It seems to me that the decision should be an easy one to make, but I know it will be a difficult one. But here it is. Here is the deep spiritual truth here, brothers and sisters. It was Jacob's journey to reconciliation with his brother Esau that led to his transformation. Or, should we say, led to his salvation. It is bound up together. My salvation is bound up with my reconciliation with you. God bless us as we do the wrestling hard work. It's night, but daybreak can come. Amen.